On the 8th of May, it's the anniversary of VE Day, 75 years. So I've done an interview with my granddad, and I'd like to share his interesting stories with you. Hi Grandad, so we're going to ask you a couple of questions and a bit of a conversation. Can you start off by telling us how old you were and where you lived during the Blitz?
Well, when the war started, and the Blitz was right at the beginning of the war, it was in 1940, and I was 5 years old, probably between 5 and 6, when the Blitz actually started, a bit younger than you. And we lived on the edge of London in a place called Woodford, which was about 10 miles from the centre of London. But we were right sort of in a built-up area.
What was life like living through the war?
It was a bit difficult. As a child, I can't ever remember sort of living in any way different from what we did to the war. And one thing I do remember, and I used to, I think, drive my mother and father crazy because I was continually asking this question. I would say to them, what is it like when there isn't a war, when the war is over? And of course, they found it very difficult to say because they didn't know, not that I didn't know, whether, we would actually win the war or whether we would actually lose the war. So it was a bit frustrating, I can see now, for them. But for me, I had no idea what it was like to live in any other way other than with the war, with guns firing and bombs falling and rationing and things like that. It was all quite normal to me.
What did your dad do in the Home Guard?
My dad wasn't actually in the Home Guard as such, but he was in what was known as a branch of the civil defence where he was a fire watcher. Now, fire watchers used to go out each evening and night on a sort of rota business. You probably go out 3 or 4 times in the week and would stay out all night to look out and make sure that if there were any fire bombs dropped and there was damage done that started fires, he would be responsible for helping putting the fires out. But he wasn't actually in the Home Guard, but he was in what was called the civil defence, and they had fire watchers and they had all sorts of people doing voluntary work. The women would make food and soup and things like that in soup kitchens and that, but he was in the civil defence.
An air raid shelter?
An air raid shelter? No, we didn't have an air raid shelter, at least not to start with. When we were first bombed, we had no air raid shelter, and we had to leave our house because it was so badly damaged, and we stayed with friends for about 2 years. But when we did go back to our house after there were sort of very basic repairs done, we were given what was known as a Morrison shelter, which was an indoor shelter made, it was like a very big table, but it was made out of iron and steel, and it had steel legs, steel top, and sort of mesh around the side that you could go under and sleep in. But that was all the shelter we did have. The other shelters that were available in the war, the Anderson shelters, not everybody by any means all had Anderson shelters. You had to live in an area where it was deemed that the enemy might bomb sort of railways or factories or that. And these shelters were sort of little metal iron huts that you could erect in the garden of your house, so that if your house was actually bombed, the theory was that at least you'd be underneath in the shelter, which you sort of had to dig out a sort of pit.
Did your house ever get bombed?
Yes, the house got bombed in the Blitz. It was a night, I think, in late September, and because we didn't have any shelter, my mum and dad had arranged for me and my brothers, I had two brothers, that we actually slept under we had a big oak wooden table in the back room downstairs, and we actually slept under that, and they sort of slept nearby on the sofa. So we didn't actually have any shelter. But luckily, when the bomb did fall, well, it was a landmine, it fell at the back of the house, and when the ceilings and the plaster and the glass and that came down, luckily my brothers were under the table, and luckily the apartment from my father, who did get hit with some glass, luckily my mother didn't. But that was our experience of being bombed. But you know, once that was all over, we sort of got out, and the next day it was obviously we couldn't continue living there, so we went to stay with an aunt of mine, my father's sister, and her husband, a few miles away at Chingford.
Do you remember how it felt when it happened?
Not really. I remember there was sort of this big bang, and the sort of the lights went out, and the bits of the ceiling fell down, and the glass from the windows all blew in. I suppose I must have been scared, but I honestly can't remember being particularly frightened, because in a way by that time I was used to hearing all these bangs and things. I obviously must have been a bit alarmed about it all, but I can't remember it as being as such. Similarly, talking about bombing, I suppose it must have been about 3 months later, when we were living, as I said, we went and stayed with my aunt in Chingford, but for various reasons we had to move on, and we were given the chance of living in some rooms with a friend of my mother in Walthamstow, which was a neighbouring town, and we were on the excuse me, the upstairs floor there. My brother and I were asleep in bed one evening, and my brother and I slept in the room at the front of the house. By this time, there were no shelters for us to sleep in. We're not even tables to sleep under, so we just got on with it, sleeping as best we could in the normal bed. And my brother and I, this is Uncle Bernard. You know Uncle Bernard, yeah. We were. This was in the evening time, so I suppose it was probably about 9 or 10 o'clock, because my mum and dad, well, I think dad was on fire watching duty, so he wasn't in the house, but mum was elsewhere at the back of the house. A bomb fell in front of the house and blew the front window in, and miraculously, because it was a very old Victorian house and it had a very solid sort of framework, the framework, again, miraculously, it was blown in the room, and it fell across the bed on top of my brother and I, and we of course had got under the blankets, and the glass sort of smashed on us, and then when they had got the sort of frame and locked off the bed and us out of it, neither of us had a scratch on it at all. And yet the whole window had sort of smashed on top of us. So it was rather, again, miraculously that we survived that. And again, as for feeling frightened, I suppose I must have been scared at the time, but perhaps it's in my nature not to get awfully uptight about these things, because, you know, we just carried on, mother cleared up the mess and that, and we got on with it and carried on as best we could. There was a third time when we were a bit worried that my brother Bernard this was later in the war, at the time of the doodlebugs, and we thought that he might have been on a bus that had got hit by one. But again, luckily, he should have been on it, but he told us afterwards that he couldn't be. He was coming home from school. He couldn't be bothered to run and catch that bus, so he decided to get the later one. And again, he missed being hit by it because that bus unfortunately was hit by the doodlebug. But doodlebugs were very scary because they were sort of known also as flying bombs, and they had so much fuel. They was like fired from the continent in the General Directorate of London, and after a time the fuel would run out, and when the fuel ran out, the plane would coast down and crash wherever. It was quite sort of arbitrary where the planes would go. But the frightening part was you could hear the drone of the engine, but if you then heard the engine cut out, you knew that within 5 or 6 seconds it was going to fall somewhere, and you didn't know whether it was going to be on you or somewhere else, particularly if you couldn't see it. So the flying bombs were, I think, very scary, and I do remember being scared about hearing flying bombs and that. And of course, I was that little bit older. This was happening when I was in about 1943 or 44, when I was probably about 8 or 9, you see. So I was that little bit older, and I'm probably aware of the more dangers than I was when I was younger.
So was that the scariest part of the bombing?
I found that the scariest part of it, the doodlebugs, yeah. Because as I say, when you heard the engine cut out, you didn't know if it was going to fall on you or if you were going to get away with it. Luckily, each time it happened, I seemed to get away with it. Well, I did get away with it.
Did you still live life normally in between?
Well, it's normally as we could. When there was always, if there was going to be a raid of bombing, not that they could very much with the two doodlebugs, but at the beginning of the war with the Blitz, when the aircraft came over to drop the bombs, the air raid siren would be sounded, and you'd all take shelter. So you if you were outside, you made sure you were inside and you got shelter somewhere. But in between that, when there wasn't a raid going on, well, you got on, lived your life as much as best you could. I used to go to school every day, and there were brick shelters in the playground, which if the siren went during the daytime, as it did sometime, we'd all have to hurriedly make our way from our classroom into the shelter. And we spent lots of time in the shelters because there were lots of raids. But we did things like, I think that's probably where I learned my tables, learned things by heart. And we used to sing songs, popular songs of the day, like Mersey Dotes and Dozy, Mersey Dotes and Dozy Dotes and little lambs eat ivy, a kittle lay the ivy too, wouldn't you? That sort of thing. And run, rabbit, run, run, run. Then songs like that, so all popular songs of the day. We'd sing those and have the teachers would sort of give us verbal spelling tests of spelling words and things like that. It was all so much, whatever came into their minds and whatever we could do and how long the air raid lasted. So it was, a bit strange to know, because again, although there was lighting in the shelter, they were big brick shelters with just lights, and we sat on the forms in sort of rows. It was all a bit made up as you went along.
Was anyone in your family evacuated?
Yes, my brother Bernard was evacuated. He was always 7 years older than me. So he was at school, and the school was sent to a place in Essex called Malden, and he was evacuated out with a family, and he spent about 6 months evacuated. And then, because nothing had happened anywhere in the country, it was known, not perhaps then, but afterwards, as sort of the phony war, where nothing happened for about 6 months. He came back and you know, lived and went to school as usual.
How did rationing work, and what did you eat?
Rationing started quite early in the war, and things like butter, eggs, meat, cheese, that was all on ration. And my mother had to sign up to always go to the same grocer to get the shop, and you'd have a ration book. And I've got some somewhere that I can show you sometime. If I remember, I could have fished them out and show you now. But you had coupons in, and when you bought the stuff, a coupon would be taken out. You were only allowed so much a week. I think it was something like each person was allowed 2 eggs per week. So, you know, it was obviously difficult for my mother and other people like her to sort of budget and arrange the things, like, because again, with cheese, it was something like probably about 4 ounces of cheese per person per week. And you had to sort of make up on food that wasn't ration, which was mainly vegetables. So there was lots of gardens were turned over. I remember our back garden, my father turned over, so we had potatoes and cabbages and things like that that you could grow and eat. And strange enough, bread wasn't rationed until at the end of the war, when there was a big shortage of flour. But bread wasn't rationed, so you could sort of exist on bread. But it was very basic food that you had then, and you ate it all up. And there was one of my big memories from the war, that at each mealtime, my mother would insist on us all eating everything up and not to waste the food. You didn't pick over, and what you put in front of you, you ate. And if you didn't eat it, well, you just went hungry, so you got into the habit of eating what was put in front of you. So there was very little, you know, stuff that you could sort of choose, and what you did have to choose, you jolly well ate. So although we didn't starve, I mean, we didn't have all the goodies and things, because sweets and that were all rationed, because sugar was rationed. So we didn't have things like sweets and crisps and things like that, all those savouries. It was very, very basic fare, very basic fare.
Was there any like main substitutes to some of these main foods, like eggs and sugar? Was there anything?
There was something called saccharines that was sort of a sugar substitute, little sort of tablets. I'm not quite sure what the saccharines made, but I'm not sure. But they sort of sweetened your tea. You put 1 or 2 in your tea. There were other things like, oh, excuse me, let me think. What else was there? There was substitute. There was hardly any proper coffee, but there was something called chicory camp coffee, which was a sort of liquid. I'm not quite sure even now what it was made of, that you'd sort of pour a spoonful into the cup and put hot water on it, and it was supposed to taste like coffee. I'm not sure that what it tasted like. Similarly, milk, that was rationed, but you could also get dried milk, which was packets of dry powder. Actually, I'm thinking about it, that you might even be able to still get dried milk and so, or an evaporated milk and condensed milk, which were in tins, which sort of supplemented the fresh milk ration. So there were those substitutes, and there were substitutes for like making cakes. I'm not quite sure what. Actually, I think carrot cake, which is quite a favour now, I think that was more or less discovered in the war, that you could sort of make cakes out of mashed up carrots and things like that. So if you were a cook in the war, and my mum was a good cook, she, improvised and made up whatever she could out of whatever she had.
Can you remember much about VE Day or D-Day?
Strangely, although I was older, I don't remember that much about when we were actually told. We heard over the radio that the war was over, and we sort of listened. There was no television then, but we heard on the radio that there were celebrations going on. I do remember then there were street parties sort of a week or two after, and I do remember there was a street party in Chelmsford Road where everybody, so they set up tables outside because it was in the summer. The end of the war came on the 8th of May, so I suppose it was probably about the end of May. People, they all decided all over the country to sort of have parties. And there was a street party, and there was tables with, you had sandwiches and jelly and orangeade and things like that.
Have you got any funny stories from the war, like things you always remember?
The one thing I do remember was one afternoon, and I can't remember why, but I'll tell you the background. My brother Bernard, he went to a secondary school, which was at the end of a lane. It was in the country outside of Woodford. At the end, you sort of got a bus to the end of the lane, and you had to walk down the lane for, I suppose, about a mile to where the school was. And the school was on the edge of a village which had an RAF aerodrome, and there were planes there. And the school, it was a new school for it. It had only been built 2 or 3 years before the war. It was a new school built on the edge of this village, with next door to the aerodrome. And one day, my mother and I were going down to meet him at the school, or perhaps something was happening at the school where my mother was needed. Anyway, we were walking down this afternoon along the lane, and the enemy fighters came over. As what happened, they would make their targets the airfield, and they would fly low and fire quite indiscriminately as they flew over the airfield to disable the planes or drop bombs on them or anything like that. Well, Mum and I were walking down the lane when these, I think it was two aircraft came over, and I think it was because going down the lane ahead of us was an RAF lorry or something, which would be an ideal target for them to shoot up and sort of stop. So as we were walking down the lane, they swooped down and were shooting at presumably the lorry, but it was very random the way they shot. So my mother dragged me with her under the trees that happened there and popped up her umbrella as sort of protection against being shot at by the end. But then, as she realised afterwards, and jokingly said and told many times later, an umbrella would have been a fat lot of use to enemy fighter planes shooting bullets at her, but at least it served its purpose at the time. It gave us some shelter under the tree and under the umbrella, and we got away with it. They flew off, and we carried on to school. carried on to school. So I think that was one of the funny. There were probably other funny events. We used to try and always see the sunny side of life. But no, I do remember that time being dragged under the tree, because at that stage I would only have been about probably 7 or 8. Yes, yeah. So yeah, that's my funny story, being shot at and sheltering under the umbrella.
Final thing, what could people living through COVID-19 now learn from living through the war?
Well, I think the thing is that you've just got to take each day as it comes and hope for the best and look to the side. Although in some ways living through COVID-19 has its similarities with the war, in the fact that you're sort of inside and you can't sort of speak with your family and do things like that. We know that things will definitely get better for us. In fact, I heard on the news earlier on, we're past the peak in this country, and we've got to keep obeying the laws and the rules that are made, which there were plenty in the war that we had to play for. So in that way, it's very similar, but the difference is, at least now we know there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that things will improve. Whereas in the wartime, there was no guarantee that things would improve, that we would actually win the war. And there was quite obviously, from people older than myself, must have realised that it would have been dreadful hardship had we have lost the war. It was hard enough winning the war with the hardship that went, but at least we were still our own, ruled by our own country. Whereas and similarly now, we know things will get better, but the difference between now and then was then that we didn't know we'd get out of it. We will get out of this. So in a way, we can sit back and make sure that we do as we're told, and things will get better, hopefully.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been great and really interesting.
That's all right, dear. And if there's anything else you want to know, as I say, when this is over, I can actually show you things like ration books, and there might be other bits and pieces about wartime and the family that you might be interested in.
So I hope you all enjoyed that. I definitely did. I found it really interesting. I especially liked his story about being shot at and using the umbrella. I thought that was very funny. So don't forget to subscribe. Bye!